humanity, and the international community should support and encourage and help states to exercise this responsibility. That's part one. It also says that the international community, through the United Nations, has the responsibility to take appropriate diplomatic, humanitarian, and peaceful steps in accord with this Chapter 6, which I read you earlier, to help protect populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. And then it says, and this is the sort of the problematic part that we'll be beginning to deal with today, and we'll deal with in other parts of the course, that should these peaceful means not work, we are prepared to take collective action in a timely and decisive manner through the Security Council in accordance with the Charter on a case-by-case basis, should peaceful means prove inadequate and national authorities manifestly fail to protect their populations from genocide, war crimes, and so forth. So that's where we're going. And we're going to see today how the conversation that we'll be dealing with, that we'll be encountering again later in the course, begins. So the difficulties that we're seeing today in this problem of when can you intervene, under what circumstances do you intervene, how effective is intervention, and so forth, are stories which begin in the period that we're talking about today. So this is then a prehistory of something that we're going to be getting several times over in the course, and we're also going to be seeing several times over the problem of the so-called political neutrality of humanitarian interventions versus the position that all humanitarian interventions are in some sense political and indeed ought to be political. So that's our telos, not in today's lecture but in future lectures. So this is installment 1 of a series of talks that I'm going to be giving you. So let me just give you the very broad frame of this in the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution, in some sense, makes manifest an issue that one already saw in this earlier French Constitution of 1793 about the social question. The Industrial Revolution, the mass urbanization, and with it, the increase in wage labor, with urbanization, a relative decrease in agricultural populations who were dependent on older paternalist relationships with the owners of land, creates a situation in which there's a great deal of discussion about the relationship between morality on the one hand and the market on the other, between an individual on the one hand and social claims on the other. So, in the very broadest sense, the Industrial Revolution threatened old paternalist models of charity and caring, and seems to substitute the market, which is the cash nexus in the economic sphere, and for deeper human relations, and politically seemed to produce a certain sort of liberalism by which kind of proposed freedoms from and freedom for the individual, and didn't address adequately the social question. So there's a great deal of conversation in the early 19th century, especially in Britain, but in other countries too, about the need of the state to intervene in the conditions of groups of people, conditions produced by something presumably outside of their immediate control. So this is the very broadest context for what I'm going to be talking about today. But it means then the condition of factory workers and of children and of unemployed agricultural laborers and of a whole class of people come to be the concern of different constituencies within each nation. So that's my first very general point. The second point I wanted to make is that Europeans also see themselves very much as being witnesses to and the bearers of progress in a deeply teleological sense. In other words, we know which direction history is going. It's going in this direction first with us, and the rest of the world, presumably at some point, will, on their own or with our benefits, move in this same progressive direction. And so I just want to give you one of many hundreds of visual representations of this. What you see here is a poster made for the 50th, for the Golden Jubilee of Queen Victoria. And what you see here is sort of before and after. You have a sailing ship and you have a steamship. You have a stagecoach and you have a locomotive. You have gas. You have pitch lights, just tar on posts, and you have gas mantle lights produced from coal. And around the edges, you have engineers, the great heroes of this culture, who made this possible. So, in other words, Europeans see themselves as the bearers, not just of the creators, not just of material progress, but of moral progress, unprecedented in world history. So that's the position from which Europeans regard the world. So that's the sort of general ideological framework of the story I'm going to tell you. Let me just look at the political order. The European political order was settled at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, and it was a continuation and a restatement of the international order that emerged from the middle of the 17th century of 1648 of internationally recognized sovereign states whose political regimes and social relations were off limits to other states. So the French Revolution that produced this situation in which French armies had marched into the German states and into Italy and into Spain in the interest of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. The French were going to end feudalism, they were going to end unfree relationships, they were going to end the rule of the clerisy, they were going to move history a step forward, and they produced these revolutionary, the consequence of which were these revolutionary wars, which swept through Europe from 1792 to 1815, in some way a kind of parallel to the religious wars of that followed the Reformation. And the treaty and the Congress of Vienna, like the Treaty of Westphalia 2 centuries before, it says no. Each state minds its own business and keeps its own and runs its own politics. So it's a reinstatement of the idea of sovereign states and of the integrity of sovereign states. Now, that in principle held for much of the century, except, and there are always exceptions, when the forces of revolution were loosened in some states. The revolutions of 1848 were an example. The conservative states of Europe did intervene. So, for example, the democratic revolution in Hungary in 1848 was suppressed by Russian troops, called in, as it were, by the Austrians, who were under whose empire Hungary was. But nevertheless, there was intervention for particular sort of usually conservative causes, and there were other examples of this. By and large, states were meant to and did stay out of the affairs of other European states, in keeping with an earlier tradition. Now, the second point that's crucial here, then, is the imperial context. Now, the imperial context is different because, from the European point of view, many of the places in which where the empire developed either had no states, as understood by Europeans, or had very weak and crumbling states, as, for example, the Mughal Empire in India. But the crucial point for you to think about for this lecture is that, in fact, the stage upon which Europeans operated was vastly expanded. This will be relevant to the next lecture as well, but I'm sort of giving you the prelude to that. So not just in North America, this is the British. This is the British Empire, which is still Canada, but huge swaths of East Africa, Australia, of course, India, Sri Lanka, and so forth. So Europe, as a political power, in different ways, it becomes vastly more international. And its relationship to the domestic affairs, if you will, of these places is radically different than its relationship to the domestic affairs of the sovereign states of Europe. Though exactly what that will be is as you'll see, debated. And in the 19th century, people already understood the fact that what was done in the interests of progress was not always exactly progressive. So the civilization of modern Europe, you see here, in a nationalist Egyptian cartoon as not as glorious as you might imagine. And you'll see this next week when we read critiques of Belgian imperialism and the